Hello. Hi, everybody. It's so lovely to see you all. I can see several people that I know, and I can also very thankfully see Annalee. I want to just right at the beginning give a big shout out to Tia Monique Uzor, who is the postdoctoral fellow on my project CARICUK. And she is doing wonderful technical things today. She's not only hosting this Zoom, but she's also live streaming to YouTube. So I just want to express my appreciation to Tia Monique, who's had to learn a lot very, very quickly and is hugely capable. The more you give to Tia Monique to do, the more she does wonderfully. So yeah, that was the first thing that I wanted to do, just make sure that I said that about Tia Monique. The second thing that I want to do is just to welcome you all and to really thank you for just responding so positively to our tweets and everything that we've done. Annalee, have you frozen? I'll wait and see that. I'm sure she'll come back. Yeah, so thank you so much for having responded so positively. I want to just describe who we have here and how we've arranged things. So we have Annalee Davis, who I'm going to be in dialogue with in just a moment. We also have what we've been calling a curated audience. This is a nice term that I learned from Tia Monique, which is really a group of people that I've invited to participate in a bit slightly more full-on way with the conversation. So these are people that I've either worked with before or have been to conferences with or just been hugely impressed by in terms of their work, etc. So they are about 15 people who are on the Zoom call. And when Annalee and I have finished speaking together, they will ask questions, give comments, and just kind of make for a warm conversation, we hope, on Zoom. Those of you who are coming in by YouTube, you're also extremely welcome. Thank you very much for giving us an hour of your evening. I know on a Friday, for us in the UK anyway, it's Friday evening, and that sometimes for me, that's usually my collapse evening. So I really appreciate that you would come along to a conversation and listen in with us. If you have comments, we'd love to hear them. Do just put them in the chat on YouTube, and Tia Monique will pay attention to those. If at all we have time, we will certainly deal with them live. Otherwise, we'll certainly look at them and we'll certainly try, and they certainly will help us anyway in our thinking. So just to one more thing that's sort of housekeeping. If any of you are on Twitter, and I know that many of you are, please do use the hashtag CARICUK, CARICUK, if you'd like to do any live tweeting about this event or afterwards tweeting about this event. I'd love to sort of see what you've all made of it. All right, so let me just tell you a little bit about who I am and what CARICUK is, because I've mentioned CARICUK a couple of times. So I'm Pat Noxolo. I'm a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And I just want to mention that I've got a slightly odd video, which seems to be giving me something that looks like a filter. I really haven't put a filter on, it's just misbehaving itself. So yeah, pay no attention, just listen to what I'm saying. So yeah, so Pat Noxolo, senior lecturer in human geography, and that's kind of relevant for what we're talking about today. One of the things that interested me about Annalee's work is that there's a lot that's geographical in there, lots of work about landscape, about maps and contours, about place, very strongly about place. Lots of things that overlap with the things that I've been interested in for very many years. So, but I also know that there's been a huge kind of spatial turn across a lot of disciplines, and I'm very excited that this the group that we brought together on Zoom and the wider group of you on YouTube, that there's lots of interdisciplinarity there. There are lots of people coming from lots of different disciplines and thinking about space and place and landscape and all of these, and environment, of course, and climate change. So all of you are very, very welcome from that point of view. Now, CARICUK, this project that I keep mentioning, is called in long, Creative Approaches to Race and Insecurity in the Caribbean and in the UK. So this idea of insecurity, it's in/security, it's a negotiation between security and insecurity. And so the bottom line of this project is that nobody lives in full security and nobody lives in full insecurity. We all, every day, just on a day-to-day basis, in our bodies, and I'm particularly interested in forms of embodiment, but with our landscapes, in our places, wherever we are negotiating between security and insecurity in an ongoing way. I want, as the project moves on, to think about race in particular, and to think about race as a form of negotiation between security and insecurity, between difference, across difference. I want to think about, in particular, as we get towards the end of the project, really challenging the educational institutions that I'm part of to think more deeply about race and to negotiate with Black communities, particularly in the UK. This is something that we've been starting to think about within geography. It's thinking much more deeply over the last decade. What I really want to do is to challenge. So we're starting with these provocations, 3 provocations, of which this is the first. Then there'll be a learning pack for schools. So we want to really kind of get to the heart of education. Then there'll be 3 films challenging higher education, and there'll be a publication prototype. We're doing all of that in 1 year. So please hold on to your hats, watch this space, and you'll see quite a lot happening. Please do participate and join in. We'd love to hear what you think and how you want to be part of that. All right, so enough from me. I want now just to give Annalee Davis a little bit of space to introduce herself. I think she can do that a lot better than I can do it. To introduce herself and her work, and tell us a little bit about yourself, Annalee.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Pat, for inviting me to be part of this provocation. And thank you to Monique and the entire CARICUK team for supporting my involvement in this incredible project. Speaking about the embodiment of Caribbean insecurity, it looks a little dark, even though it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon here. I'm sure most of you have heard about the eruption of La Soufriere, which is about 100 miles west of Barbados. So just thinking about people in St. Vincent today, but we are affected because that ashfall heads east to us. And so I'm in my home, but all of my windows and doors are closed. And if I cough, pardon me, because the ash is just in the air. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. In a nutshell, my training is as a visual artist. I was away for most of the 80s, and I chose to return to Barbados in the Caribbean at the end of the 80s. I started traveling across the region from the early 90s to start building alliances with my peers across the English, Dutch, Spanish, and French Caribbean. I have a hybrid practice as an educator at Barbados Community College for some time, as a cultural activist, founding an artist-led initiative called Fresh Milk 10 years ago, and then the co-founding of a program called Caribbean Linked in Aruba, which is a residency for young Caribbean artists, and the forum Tilting Axis. I've worked with the British Council as their Caribbean art manager for a couple of years, and most recently have launched a curatorial agency with my colleague Holly Bino called Sour Grass. I'm working as a visual artist, and I think what's interesting about this exchange with Pat is that I've been on this one specific site for the last 20 years, which has become a really important foundation for me to be building a relationship with this landscape in multiple ways as an artist and activist through an archaeological collaborative project called Unearthing Voices with an archaeologist at CUNY in New York, Dr. Matt Riley, in an attempt to find the site of an enslaved village on this property. So I'm currently on land that's about 120 acres. It was initially a sugar plantation in 1667. It converted to farming, which my brother runs over 35 years ago. So it's been a dairy farm. But its history as a plantation is very central to a lot of what I do. And trying to understand the vestiges of the plantation socially, economically, ecologically, and this idea of a post-plantation economy and trying to see beyond the plantation of a model. So that's a little bit of an introduction.
Thank you very much, Annalee. So I want to start our dialogue by just thinking about the video that you very kindly made for CARICUK. So this video, I'm sure many of you who are present have seen the video, and you can find on our website, caricuk.co.uk, you can find a link to the video. But the video is called Walking Old Lands, Drawing New Lines. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about how you thought about the video, what it was that you wanted to achieve in the look and what the video says.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I was conscious that this was being commissioned by a UK entity and a geographer, and so I was really interested in trying to provide a context for my work, and I wanted to be able to show this landscape. So. Working with a videographer, Justin Went, a young Barbadian videographer, we spoke a lot beforehand about how to kind of communicate this in a way that people would understand the link between this landscape and the work that I'm making. So I saw this as an opportunity to provide that kind of context and to link it to this particular landscape. I walk a lot, and I see walking as a kind of a ritual within this particular site. So I wanted to, my body would be moving through the landscape as another kind of way to draw a line within the landscape. So I wanted to show this kind of ritual act of walking on a very regular basis. And I also wanted to select a number of works that I thought could make sense within the very short time frame of the video, and to show the organic relationship between those works so that your audience would have an understanding of how they kind of interrelated. And yeah, I think the title, Walking Old Lands, speaks about the agency of walking. It speaks about history. And then the drawing new lines is an attempt to make a connection to the act of drawing, but the potential, the fact that every line hasn't been drawn, that there is the potential for making, new lines, new images, new connections, new relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really struck me, actually, this where you say in the video that there are new lines to be drawn. And I really liked that. I like the kind of that there's something quite generative, that very fertile and dynamic about the idea that you can actually draw new lines. So it's not just about kind of developing cartographical skills and then drawing lines according to a set pattern or a set idea of practice or a set of technical skills. It's about actually the fact that everybody who is in place is mapping that place, right, through moving through it, through their spatial practice, is how we refer to it in geography, so that they're constantly through use making that place. And that's an expressly kind of anti-colonial way of thinking about place, really, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, part of this interest in lines is that, of course, the Caribbean has been mapped for centuries, and these, the act of, the cartographers producing these maps and the way in which the landscape has been read suggest a particular kind of objective view that suggests an exact kind of mapping that is true. And some years ago, maybe about 7 years ago, I came across hundreds of ledger pages in an abandoned bookkeeper's office. And I sort of threw them out the building two stories down, brought them to the studio, and I have been captivated by the lines on these ledger pages that are, this kind of active bookkeeping that the British Empire did around the world, which was a precursor to today's accounting methods, but that these ledger pages were trying to tell a complete and exact story of this place. And I was interested in these very neatly drawn rows and columns, and then was thinking about the fact that a lot of the knowledge we have is from maybe the voice of a white male planter, or it's through conveyances, deeds, or wills, or these ledger pages that are trying to tell a particular kind of economic story. But I really wanted to interrupt those lines, and I wanted to push against the notion of these rows and columns that were saying everything that we needed to know, and to suggest that other lines needed to be drawn to counter that kind of economic reading. So it's, lines of plants or different bodies, or, extrapolating text from a will that, is maybe read in a different kind of way. So yeah, I think that those ledger pages were a really kind of fruitful sort of palimpsest that I've been working with for some time.
Yeah, I know when we first started talking, we were first thinking about the video, and you were thinking about you asking me what I was thinking of and what we would like to have for CARICUK. And we discovered a mutual love for Wilson Harris, the Guyanese novelist. And one of the things that Wilson Harris has really taught me, I think, is about this idea of the trace in the landscape, that the landscape itself has agency, right. That there are marks and traces left from the past. And that kind of trying to, through colonialism, trying to impose what he called rectilinear lines in the landscape, is a kind of pushing against the landscape, which is itself kind of resistant, has agency, always talks back, always leaves traces, and creates new lines constantly, creates its own new traces. So there's that lovely sense of negotiation, which is kind of at the heart of what I was talking about around in/security, that sense that even the landscape itself, it's a negotiation. Yes. Not an imposition. And that's also true across any kind of forms of difference, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started observing the wild plants growing in former sugarcane fields, and I was raised, my father was a planter, and I was raised on a number of sugar plantations. And so these wild botanicals were seen as weeds. They were unwanted plants that were either removed by hand or through the use of pesticides and chemicals. It wasn't until much later that I understood that when the kind of settler colonial class arrived and started to build the plantation, that it wiped out almost the entire biodiversity of the island. And in recent years, with the collapse of the sugar industry, which is a fraction of what it used to be, that these wild botanicals are kind of re-emerging centuries later. And they have agency, as you say, in the soil, but they then taught me that we now have the greatest biodiversity in Barbados for the first time since the 17th century because of these abandoned fields of cane and this kind of growth that's coming. And I think in addition to that, it was then learning about the power of these plants, which were being used by the indentured and the enslaved as a way to heal. So within the context of the plantation, there were these small plots of land that were given to the enslaved, through which they would feed themselves, grow food and feed themselves. But it was also, as Sylvia Winter will speak about, you know, the plot versus the plantation. The plot was a space where I think the enslaved were human. They became humanized within this kind of dehumanized, larger kind of colonial machinery. And that these plants were really important because medicine was, you know, not fully developed. And these are people that then brought knowledge and learned about the plants and used that as a way to connect to a new landscape. And it was these plants were also a vehicle for practicing, you know, sacred rituals or spiritual, Afrosyncretic spiritual practices, and for building community and sharing information. So there's, you know, a kind of a pre-capitalist kind of site within that larger context of the plantation, where oral traditions were acknowledged and humanity was shared, I think, within that way. And, you know, it also made me kind of rethink, as I say in the film, this sense that I was raised in a natural environment when it was actually a very heavily curated environment, a very manicured environment, you know, 1,742 cane holes per acre. There wasn't anything natural about the plantation. And I think what we get tripped up on very often is in the imaging of the colonial landscape, we are led to think that these things are natural. And in the process of being an artist and making work, it's also a process of relearning and unlearning differently to how we have been taught through these kind of objective structures of the colonial machinery, the narratives, the cartography, etc.
Yeah, I found all that kind of incredibly hopeful. I think that sort of idea that we can look at a landscape that we, you know, we're brought up to think is natural, and is just there, and, you know, but actually to know that that's there was that kind of monoculture that was imposed. I mean, there were some interesting lessons for us, I think, in the UK. A UK education would tend to make you feel as if the colonial times have finished. Right. And they were in the past, they were history, and we've kind of moved on from that. Whereas actually, you know, the landscape through which you're walking was carved out through colonialism, and those systems and those structures remain in the landscape. And that's really important, I think, for people in the UK to understand that that landscapes in the Caribbean carry on having those marks of colonialism. But of course, it's also really important for them as a way of understanding that the UK itself is shaped by colonialism. You don't just walk away from that relationship and say, well, okay, we're granting independence and now we're gone. That's just not how it works. It's actually inside of you, and we still are going to always have that connection between the Caribbean and the UK, because that's the longest colonial connection for the UK. And that's always going to be a part of what the UK is. Being able to see that in the UK landscapes as well, to be able to see it here as well. I know you've been doing some work in the UK as well, haven't you? Not just in Barbados.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways in which I sort of confronted that disconnect historically was in 2016. I was commissioned by the cooking sections, a curatorial duo based in the UK. They had a very expansive project called the Empire Remains Shop, and I was commissioned to produce a new work, which I mentioned in the film. It's called Bush Tea Services, and it was an attempt to acknowledge tea as, you know, one of the most heavily drunk beverages in the UK, grown on plantations in the East, sweetened with sugar from plantations in the West Indies. But to create a new bush tea service made with local Barbadian clay rather than porcelain, and kind of interjected into the tea service are these shards from the late 1700s, early 1800s. And these are clay and porcelain remains that I find whenever I walk in the land, that are kind of taken up by the cows walking through the fields, and embedding them into the tea service. So it's an imperfect tea service. So when I pour the tea, it leaks and it drips, and it kind of speaks to the messiness of history and the gaps in knowledge. But rather than serving black tea sweetened with sugar, I was harvesting plants from the fields, and I was serving a bush tea made with things like cerci, which is a very bitter plant that, you know, every Barbadian knows about. It's, you know, it's a blood purifier. Blue vervain, which is for wounds and for healing broken hearts. Lemongrass, which is for fevers, and bay leaf. And so I kind of did this as a sort of a very small reparative act, where I would bring this tea to the UK, I would serve it, and I would engage in dialogue with people who signed up to have tea with me, or would just come in off the street. I was in the a street-facing space. And I have to say, I was quite shocked by the level of disconnect and the ignorance, really, on the part of members of the kind of British audience, not really knowing their history. And I would often say to them, but I've known you for 300 years. Why do you not know who I am? How is it that your knowledge of Barbados and the Caribbean begins with the tourist sector, when you know, your development and modernization really is on the backs of Caribbean labor? How is it that from the perspective of developing syllabus and pedagogy and education, that this isn't a requirement for people to understand their own history in such a formational way? You know, I mean, this really was a very kind of shocking thing to understand the level of amnesia and erasure and maybe willful ignorance. And then I understood why there were these issues around, like the Windrush, because people really didn't seem to understand that very long interconnected history.
Yeah. That's, I think it's great how, you know, your work connects back to that sense of education. I want to bring in the curated audience at this point for any kind of comments. I want to just put a little pin on where you said about reparative acts, because Tia Monique has just put in the chat for me a question from the YouTube audience, where they're talking about walking as ritual. Can walking be a reparative ritual? So there are lots of different ways of thinking about the reparative that I want to just kind of hold on to. But yeah, what I'd like to do now is get a fuller view, great, of the people on Zoom, and any kind of questions or comments from yourselves. I'd love to hear them at this point. Yeah. So you can unmute yourselves and just ask. Susan.
Hi there. Hi, Pat. Thanks again for coordinating this, and everyone in CARICUK. And hello, Annalee Davis. It's lovely to meet you, and I really enjoyed the film. And I thought it was just really thoughtful in terms of what you were mentioning in relation to contours and that active embodiment and traveling through the landscape. And for me, it was very interesting the way that you brought together this idea of, you know, there's kind of a spatial imaginary there, but it has very material consequences, right? And I was, you know, doing a wee bit of reading, and at the same time was looking at the application for UNESCO heritage status for the Scotland district, which I thought was just this fascinating connection to, because the district is the peak of a a submarine mountain range, right? And I thought, oh, there's so many metaphors there. And I wondered if you could talk about that a wee bit, you know, this idea of being kind of the tip of not the iceberg, but in this case, a Caribbean mountainscape that, you know, as we start to kind of dig a bit deeper and walk through these landscapes, there's these other pieces like the pottery that you were finding that were unearthing. So I was wondering in what ways you found that useful to go between this sort of imagined space and the material.
Thank you. Thanks for your question, Susan. So my collaboration with Matt Riley, who is an archaeologist based in New York, has been very useful for me because I think an interdisciplinary approach is handy for all of us, right? Because then it really forces us to broaden the lens through which we're looking. My initial reach out to him was to see whether we could find the site of an enslaved village, because I have access to the Barbados archives, which is very good, from the 17th century, and that includes wills and deeds and conveyances and so on. But it's trying to understand the site through another way, and I think finding those material remains allows us to sort of understand the landscape a little bit differently. In terms of the, I guess, kind of walking in the landscape, I've been thinking recently about the difference between overseeing and interseeing. So the overseer, of course, you would know is someone whose job on the plantation was really to have surveillance, and the plantation was really designed as a place to for you to be able to see all of the action that was happening. And I think these other ways of trying to understand the landscape through the walking is trying to maybe establish this notion of interseeing and a smaller, more intimate relationship within the landscape, so that level of intimacy, I think, possibly supports maybe a need to nurture the land and also to love the land. And I think sometimes these disembodied ways of mapping, while they have absolute use and value in many, many ways, but sometimes there's a detachment, and that can then lead to a certain level of degradation or abandonment or the capacity to engage in extractive economies. So it's really trying to think about a different kind of relationship. I mean, of course, the Scotland district that you mentioned is a very interesting part of the island. It does have a relationship with Scotland through its indentured labor. When they initially arrived on the island, when the enslaved labor came in across the Atlantic, many of the indentured laborers were kind of relegated to the Scotland district. And that's another narrative that I'm interested in, because that landscape has a lot of slippage, and so their villages very often disappeared, and we don't have a lot of information about that group of people. So there's a lot that's missing, and there's a lot of work to be done. And I think using interdisciplinary and collaborative ways of working and thinking will allow us to get through that work maybe a little bit faster than if we do it on our own.
Yeah, it's a great set of connections there around heritage and land, and fascinating. Anya.
Thank you so much, Annalee. I found your video to be incredibly generative, and as a historian, I was particularly struck by some of the things that you've been saying so far in the discussion about how the Caribbean has been kind of mapped, and people have attempted to order it and to know it in particular kinds of ways. And in relation to that, I was wondering particularly about your wild plant series, whether you see that as being partly in conversation with all of those accounts which sought to kind of categorize and order and classify botanical and kind of create and produce botanical knowledge about the Caribbean, and whether you see that sense of dialogue that you're creating with your own series and featuring different kinds of plants and their uses as part of that sort of almost intervention with the colonial archive, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. Yes, I think that, I mean, my drawing of those wild plants kind of counters the more traditional illustrated botanicals. the drawings are very, they're delicate, and the color also, this is a particular color, this Victorian rose that I have been using to do those drawings mimics the color of some of the lines in the ledger pages, but it's also like bodily fluids. But the drawings, I think, are, it's not whimsical, that's the wrong word, but they're not these heavily detailed kind of botanical illustrations. There's something maybe more ephemeral about them. I think they also speak to me because they haven't been seen as important. You know, we have in Barbados one of the oldest sugar breeding stations in the world. It's been running continuously since the 19th century. And there are thousands of varieties of sugarcane, and a lot of money and effort has gone into breeding sugarcane that is perfect for rainfall and soil and that kind of thing. But there hasn't been that level of care towards these wild plants, which are very interesting to me because they allowed people to survive and to heal and to nurture and to take care of themselves and each other. So I'm not trying to work with them in a scientific kind of way, or to reference a very formal kind of herbarium that you might see at Kew Gardens. I'm trying to install them onto the ledger page to say that these two also have value and meaning, and you know, that these are things that we should be reckoning with, because a lot of that knowledge is oral and we're in danger of losing a lot of it. I think in more recent times that interest in that knowledge is building, and there are some people that are now trying, like at the University of the West Indies, to do information, to conduct studies on aloes and cerci, and I think maybe lemongrass, and there's one that I'm missing. But that's different because we are now trying to understand the value of those plants from our perspective and our history, rather than it being, you know, the mapping of Barbados and the Caribbean and a lot of decisions about what happens here has often been undertaken by people from elsewhere. I think we now need to have pride in these wild plants that are just often dismissed as weeds, and to understand their value and to feel proud that this is part of our history, and to study it from our perspective with cognizant of our history.
And presumably the kind of the work, the interventions and the work that you do then generates conversations which kind of build on those personal family understandings, knowledge of plants, oral histories and so on, so that oral history becomes ongoing.
Yes, yeah, like there's a song by a Guyanese Calypsonian, you know, where he basically, there's this bush woman who's moving through the market, and it's just this recounting of all of these plants, and it has become a really, like a little encyclopedia for people to you know, be aware of those things that exist. And so the bush tea plot that I did here at the University of the West Indies, and then subsequently was commissioned by the Harlem Art Space in Derbyshire in the UK. There's also a QR code on the plot, which takes you to a website, and that website then has information about the plants and their healing properties, and, you know, writings and research that come out of the Caribbean. So there's a kind of a back end to the art project, in that it's trying to also create an archive that values this kind of knowledge.
I love that kind of alternative pedagogy, so that's wonderful, really. So we have Mimi and then Deb.
Okay,
Mimi?
Hi Annalee, hi Pat.
Hi, great to see you.
Hi everyone, good to see you. So thank you for sharing your beautiful work, and it's so rich and there's so many things to think with here. And just one thought that came to mind in seeing the video and the discussion today is how what you refer to as the landscape is also, of course, a human-scape and a kind of task-scape. And you described the sort of cane holes, right, as a coerced place of labor that created that landscape, which is made by humans. But also what you're describing in the sort of bush tea project and the wild plants are also human right? Because of their uses and their reproduction through plots that were there over many years. So I'm thinking about how, in terms of when we talk about food security, and there's this big movement now towards regenerative agriculture, right, to help support food security, you're actually bringing in this other idea maybe of reparative agriculture, not just regenerative, but reparative, and that the wild is the human, is the bush tea, is the healing place. And so like healing the natural landscape of the post-plantation is also a human healing process. And like, so that humans and the natural and the wild are kind of working ensemble.
Thank you for that. Yes, I mean, a couple of things there is, you know, there's a lot of trauma, obviously, around this landscape, and agriculture as a post-independent space was almost a dirty word. You know, people were leaving the plantations and with free education, making very different choices. And, you know, that affects our food security because a lot of people don't want to work in the land. It has a lot of, you know, negative connotations to the history of enslavement and poor wages and whatever. But it's interesting, in the last maybe 10 years, we're seeing different approaches to that, with a local slow food movement, a building organic movement of farmers that have small plots that are trying to grow food responsibly. At the end of the video, I share a collaboration that I'm just working on now with what was a sand quarry that is now becoming this permaculture regenerative site, and trying to think about how to engage with the landscape in a way that can heal. And so my small intervention there on this 220-acre estate will be a small garden that will focus on women's reproductive and post-reproductive health. So using wild botanicals that will hopefully live on that very kind of rugged, windswept East Coast, which is in the Scotland district. But yeah, I think repairing our relationship to labor in the land and to the soil is something that is so important, because we import probably 90% of what we eat. And when things like the volcano or hurricanes happen, and our dependency on food moving through Miami, you know, we really saw this during COVID as well. So I think we have to develop a new model, a post-plantation model and post-extractive ethics to think about our own health and well-being in ways that are different to how we were taught. You know, outside of that plantation model, how do we form more healthy, healing relationships with the soil? So thank you for picking up on that.
Yeah, and that's part of a whole set of questions that are partly one of the things that I want to think about in relation to the Caribbean and the UK is, you know, we're small island states, right? So the UK can't afford to sort of disconnect itself from what's happening in the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is facing things that as a small island states we will be facing. Instead of seeing other countries as our past, we kind of need to see them as our future and make those connections. Okay, so Deb and then Agostina, please.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Pat. Hi, Annalee. Good to see those of you who I know and to meet those of you who I don't. In a way, you just provided a kind of answer to the thing I wanted to ask you, but I wanted to sort of tell you, I guess, some of the things that watching the video brought up for me, and then ask you something, but maybe you could just respond generally. When you were walking and talking about the lines, it made me actually think about Congo cosmograms, you know, with the 4 points and the end directions and the inner circle of the water and the physical world and the spiritual world, and then the directional arrows. And it as you were sort of walking and drawing and sort of creating this other kind of map, which is how I think about those cosmograms also, it's a mapping also of the ancestral spiritual relations as well. And so it made me think about, you know, in terms of a landscape, what kind of an archive a landscape is, and what kind of an archive plants are, right? Not only of, you know, as we know, many Indigenous communities understand landscape as archiving history, as being kin, also as not inhabiting a different kind of living being, right? Of economies, as you're picking up these ceramic bits, you know, from deposited by cows and other living entities. And then within sort of other Indigenous cosmologies, also of futures, right? Disturbing that line, not only between the physical world and the spiritual world, but between the past and the present and the future. So I was going to ask you what kinds of futures you see being embedded in these kind of archiving practices that you have with landscape, you know, the layering, and you sort of, you know, you provided one kind of answer talking about the sand quarry and sort of imagining that, reworking that as nutrition for maternal health, right? But I wonder if you can say more too about those you know, material futures, but also spiritual futures too.
Yeah, I think the spiritual futures is interesting because, you know, a lot of the practices that would have been associated with the use of these wild plants would have been connected to Afrosyncretic rituals, something called obia in Barbados, and different names in different places, which was an illegal practice for a very long time. So there has also been a sense of shame and you know, the covert use of and covert practices that are associated with the plants. So I think one of maybe the futures around that is it's not really decriminalization. I mean, I guess it is, but it's also about having a different relationship to that knowledge and maybe teaching history differently in very, very real ways. So I think the thing about the Caribbean is that, and I think through Wilson Harris, you know, that we're living with the past and the future and the present all at the same time. So I think that it's about trying to tell those stories differently. For example, there is a project at the University of the West Indies in collaboration with a university in the US where people in the public are asked to come in and to transcribe runaway slave ads as a way to mark that information that tells us more about slave society than we thought, because it also counters particular narratives, because a lot of times you might see somebody's husband or somebody's wife or somebody's child. So there's a sense that there weren't family structures. Well, there were family structures. So I think there are different ways of reading against the grain of history that seems to be coming up in the moment, and also learning more from the Indigenous voice. One of the objects that I have found with Dr. Riley is an Indigenous artifact, which I was surprised at because we're in the center of the island. And I thought that the Indigenous people who had left by time the British had arrived in the early 17th century were mostly on the coast. So what I now have in terms of writing the story about where I am is it goes back maybe to, 600 years earlier than what I thought. So I think that it's about trying to read and tell our history differently and understand it differently, and to do that in an interdisciplinary, collaborative way so that we can come up with other models, because the extractive models that we've inherited have basically gone from sugar to tourism. It's another kind of extractive economy, and it's not necessarily working. And we haven't even asked ourselves what tourism is going to look like in a post-COVID space. So I think we really need to come up with other kinds of models for that are not about growth. I mean, I keep thinking about degrowth and slow cultural work. How can we think about moving beyond this need for constant expansion and growth in a way that will serve us better than the models we've been doing for the last few hundred years. I'm not sure if that answers anything. It feels very long-winded.
I think the main thing is just getting lots of ideas out here and generating those ideas, right? Agustina.
Thank you, Pat. First off, I just want to say thank you, Annalee. I really enjoyed your video, and you know, I was really struck by the drinking of the tea and seeing the liquid leaking into the ground. You know, and I don't know, it's such a powerful image for me. But in a sense, really, that's not the question that I'm asking. And perhaps it's related to it, I'm not sure. Insofar as your use of the word wild to kind of, you know, the wild plant series, you know, I'm wondering if there might not be a sense of irony that could be embedded or attached or built onto that, the usage, to convey the sense in which, using what you said at the beginning, that the plantation is, I mean, a lot of what was the curating of space, it was a very unnatural, and one could, I mean, in the sense in which we think about biodiversity and alien invasive species, one could imagine that the plantation itself was an alien invasive species in the context of how we understand those terms now. And so that, you know, here are these plants that are protruding out of the ground and disrupting space as it was being organized. So that in a sense, really, that's a natural environment resisting the projects of enslavement and oppression. And so I was wondering, in a sense, if that might not be, you know, if there couldn't be a sort of irony that is built into the use. And in a sense, that's to take up the question around pedagogies, you know, in the way that we're then going to teach about these histories as a sort of a way of intervening in these colonial narratives and disrupting them. You know, so I was just kind of, I don't know what my question really is, in a sense, but in a sense to kind of orient or lens or lenses to look at the way in which language is then functioning to keep in place the very structures that we're trying to work against. You know, and so the use of the word wild, you know, to think even of the Taínos and the Amerindians who inhabited this space before. And so for them, these weeds, such as they are the natural parts of the plantation, of the environment, rather. So that's my contribution.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, there's a sense that the plantation was normal and everything else was wild. I mean, I've also been thinking about wildness in my own aging body, and I've done a body of work which I haven't spoken about in the film, but about the post-reproductive female body, and that part of that aging process is about embracing wildness, that there is a part of us that is wild, and but there's a sense that everything needs to be ordered and controlled. So I have found in my own life that this transition into the post-generative phase of life has allowed for a certain kind of relationship with wildness to exist. But I hear what you're saying, and I think that that's an interesting point. Thank you.
Lots of really interesting things in there, and lots from feminist writing about the postmenopausal female body and kind of monstrousness, but also, you know, what's incredibly threatening about those bodies as well, which I think is really interesting. Right, 7 minutes, 2 questions, Kesua and Jason, 2 questions that I really want to hear. So I'll take you one after the other, okay? Kesua.
Hi, I really enjoyed the film as well. I'm going to be very quick. I'm not even sure it's a real question, but I wanted to kind of say that it was really struck me when you talked about the plantation as a non-natural space. You talked about the number of square meters and cane holes per acre. And it was interesting for me, growing up in London with Caribbean parents, I had so much of the mythology of activities and stories set around cane fields that when I spent time in the Caribbean, there was a certain magic to it that kind of, it pulled on the stories I'd heard growing up. And so much so that when I had a job that had me working near a cane field, I preferred to walk alongside the cane field like 45 minutes home than take a bus, because it was like walking through the cane fields on the way home. Because there's so much of our stories that are centered around this, you know, this plant that has dominated the landscape throughout the Caribbean. So that really hit me, like there's nothing natural about that. It's a completely unnatural landscape that somehow has really pervaded my subconscious in ways that have been taught to think of it as natural. So that was really quite disruptive, and I really appreciated that. But I kind of really wanted to talk more about the, when you talked about archives and archiving, I'm a historian as well. And so the way that you mentioned how you were shocked when you got to the UK and people had kind of no sense of the connection with the Caribbean, which is, as Pat has said, the longest colonial connection, the oldest, the most transformative in lots of ways. It set the stage for so many things yet to come afterwards. And I kind of was curious about that was shocking to you. I think for some of us who have lived in the UK or grown up in the UK, we're so familiar with that amnesia that we don't even think of it as an amnesia, really. We kind of forget how much of the stakes of teaching history properly is at play, really, or are at play. I think I kind of wanted to, I think that, and then this has been a really interesting conversation because it kind of flags up. We kind of take for granted that people hide our histories or don't teach history properly. And it was interesting to hear from you. You're like, well, what's going on? Why are you guys not learning your own history? And for us, it's like, yeah, that's a good point. Like we think of it so naturally that, you know, for us, it's,
It's not shocking. It's not
it's
shocking
not shocking
to you.
for us at all.
Yeah,
it's not shocking for us, and it should be.
It should be shocking. It should be shocking.
Be frustrated and just be like,
I love that kind of forgetting that there's an amnesia. That's a really great phrase, and I think, one that I'll keep thinking.
Like,
I mean, I think
better should we?
You know, the Caribbean historians have been writing our history from maybe the 30s from the perspective of economics and race and class and gender. I think that happened decades later in the UK. So I think it does feel like there's a really important moment happening now. And I think that the whole George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter moment is forcing more of these conversations to the table. But yeah, I mean, I guess because I live on a farmer plantation. I look at a windmill every day. We see cane fields wherever we drive. We're very conscious of our history. And because I've only started recently forming more relationships with the UK in the last 5 or 6 years, I guess I really have to say it was quite bizarre. I just couldn't. I mean, you have the Tate that's built on sugar, for God's sake. How do you not know? How do you not know this? How do you not know that your streets and your libraries and your museums, your entire modernization process was because of this? How do you not know that? It is just outrageous. So yeah, I was shocked.
Yeah.
I mean, we hope it will change, but I think there's a long way to go, actually. And I think it was a nice reminder that we really need to keep this fight up. There is, as you say, a sea change, but there's also a backlash against that sea change. Just today, they've been announcing closures of history departments that were willing to do that work. And so it's not an easy battle, but you remind us that it absolutely needs to be fought. So thank you.
I think we had a sort of pre-dialogue, myself and Annalee, and the word contention came up a lot. There's a lot of contention, right? Contention, dialogue, negotiation.
Yes.
Jason?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes,
you can hear me. Okay, yeah. Okay. Thanks so much for the work and for, that really thought-provoking documentary. My question is about the really interesting idea of post-plantation regenerative landscape. I mean, there are many things that really fascinated me what you did, but I just wanted to kind of bring that back up, and because I'm curious about what you think, to hear more of what you think about that, because I immediately thought about, I've just sat with Esther Figueroa's work for quite a while, actually reading about, the impact of bauxite on land and, the availability of land for farming, that kind of degeneration then, right? And then she talks about tourism as well, which you have also talked about, different forms of mining, and how that just is constricting more and more the access, the ability to practice farming, to kind of be self-sustaining and sustainable with respect to farming, and that sort of economy that we'd want to build to kind of be able to be in security, right? With respect to our, all of that, our food needs, and just our human kind of relationship to the land and all of that. And so then I was just struck by that, and I just thought it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about how can we be generative in a degenerating or degenerated landscape. How do we practice that? Which I find it's such a necessary place to dwell in terms of our thinking, right? And it, in a sense, it encapsulates our history as Afro diasporic people, just that really.
I mean, thank you. I think that at the level of leadership, we need to think about ourselves as active citizens who are agitating for a kind of a leadership that serves our purposes. Because what we've seen under COVID is, these growing gaps between, those who have and those who don't have. And I think we need to think about another kind of economics. There's a new model coming up that I'm trying to learn about, these donut economic models that are speaking about how to create less gaps. But, when I think about Caribbean leadership, I mean, we have a very good leader at the moment who's very popular, Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who's doing a lot of good things. And I wouldn't want to be in her place for all the tea in China, because it literally has been one crisis after another. I mean, this is the thing about being in the Caribbean. We are living in layers of crises, and we, as small island developing states, are really struggling. So there's not just now a hurricane season, there may be a volcanic season, and then there's COVID, and then there's, the IMF. And so there's just these constant layers of crises that we are trying to negotiate our very survival through. And there's this trope of resilience that I'm really getting tired of, because it is just so exhausting to be on the receiving end of all of this. So how do we think about post-plantation economics or different models? I mean, one of the issues I have with the current administration is there was the passing of the building of an 18-story hotel on one of our most important public beaches. And I think we need to agitate as citizens to say that's not good enough. There isn't room for that. We don't have the space to accommodate these all-inclusive hotels on a beach that is super important for working class Barbadians who live in the city, where there's a turtle nesting site. There's a particular kind of flora and fauna and diversity there, some of which will be lost. We need to, as citizens, be active in these discussions and think about new ways of being. I mean, I'm not an economist, so I don't have the answer to that, but I think that we can participate more fully in town hall meetings and national discourse, because the infrastructure it's not fixed and it's not working. And because we have a Black post-independent, post-colonial government doesn't mean that they're getting it all right. They are also inhabiting some of these colonial leftover ways of thinking about expanded growth and bigger and larger in ways that are not taking the environment into account. And we are on the front line of climate change and those kinds of disasters. Our leaders really need to step up to the pitch and have much more progressive thinking about that, I think. So that's I think kind of a sloppy answer to your much more kind of articulate question, but
Yeah, I think it's a huge question.
Yeah.
These questions, they're always huge. And
Yeah.
but really kind of pointed that I love that idea of how can we be generative in a degenerated landscape, because that's a global question, right?
Yeah.
As many of the things that happen in the Caribbean are kind of global agendas that are set. But that sort of idea of, you know, this is the world that we're in now. It's a degenerated landscape. So how can we be generative? How can we be creative? How can we find creative solutions? And you know, we don't do that in an hour of conversation, but we do that in, you know,
a lifetime.
We do something that I really wanted to do with this, you know, this is our first provocation event, and it's about, I think a lot of what you said in your answer there is really important. You know, how do we provoke each other into kind of creative action, into kind of doing things, not the old kind of actions that have been so destructive, but how do we provoke each other into transformation? And I think that those are kind of really key questions that I'm wanting just to unpack and open during this year. I feel like, you know, what you've given us, Annalee, through the video and your answers today is a kind of artistic approach, a creative approach, giving us a sort of sense of the reasons why I wanted to approach artists first, is that, you know, we get all this kind of opening out and generation of questions, right? Really important questions, and not this sort of closing down of trying to give secure answers.
Yeah.
But just, you know, sort of, you know, these are the questions for today. I also knew that this incredible kind of group that on Zoom of people that I've invited who I've had dealings with before, and I knew that you would generate incredible questions.
Hard questions.
I want to read out the names of people, because I should have done that at the beginning, but I want people to know who are here. So we have Sarita Mullings, Keswa John, Anya Animado, Rebecca Kitchen, Gemma Collins, Deborah Thomas, Lisa Paravizini Jebert, Susan Maines, Karen Wilkes, Jason Allen Pazant, Mimi Scheller, Rita Gale, Cynthia Agnardi, Agostino Pinnock, and Connie Bell. And I want to thank you all really so much for being part of this conversation. It's been a short conversation, but absolutely packed with all sorts of ideas, which is exactly what I thought it would be. We've recorded the conversation. We hope that we'll be able to make that available to you via the CARICUK website. So do keep an eye on the CARICUK website, caricuk.co.uk. Keep an eye out for us on Twitter at CARICUK, and on Instagram at CARICUK 2021. Annalee's video will stay on YouTube, and you can keep getting that link through the CARICUK website. Please do send me any questions or comments by email. We're just trying at the moment, as I say, to sort of generate discussion and to provoke conversations. So thank you so much for all of your presence tonight. It's been intense and it's been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pat, and everyone. I think everybody needs to have a rum. It's Friday night, so yeah, enjoy your weekend.
I'll take that as a command by Annalee.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye.